Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. He impregnated a woman who could be his grandmother. Martha Ellis, 61, lived alone in a large Victorian house in Charleston, South Carolina. The house, with its white shutters and ivy-covered facade, had once echoed with children's laughter, sung prayers, hurried footsteps, and the scent of Sunday dinner. Now it was nothing more than a vast, elegant shell, every room of which seemed silent so as not to awaken memories. Martha was an upright woman, graceful in her bearing despite the weight of her years, her hands still marked by long shifts in the hospital. She had been a nurse for more than 30 years in St. Joseph's Medical Center, known for her gentleness and endurance, able to console weeping families while managing an overwhelmed emergency room. She had devoted herself body and soul to this profession, often at the expense of her own health. Her husband, Benjamin, a beloved and respected pastor in the community, had always said that Martha had healing hands and a missionary heart. Together, they formed a strong, almost exemplary couple. But since Benjamin's sudden death 5 years earlier, a car accident in the pouring rain as he was returning from a prayer vigil, the house had frozen. The wind sometimes blew through the hallways as if to remind them of his absence. She had never taken her Bible off her nightstand or taken her jacket off the hook by the door. His children? They lived their lives elsewhere, each prisoner of their responsibilities or their wounds. Clara, the eldest, a brilliant lawyer in Seattle, only called him for the holidays or to send a quick birthday card. Always in a hurry, always between planes. Michael, her youngest son, was in the military, constantly deployed to faraway locations, his voice muffled by jet lag and shaky internet connections. He would sometimes send an email, a photo of himself in uniform, and a "I'm fine, Mom." Stephanie, the youngest, the sensitive and rebellious child, had moved away after a violent argument over her choice of partner. Since then, not a call, not a letter. Just a painful silence, like a missing piece in the puzzle of her life. Martha, on the other hand, spent her days following a routine as regular as clockwork. At 7 a.m., she would get up, make a pot of black coffee, and then go feed the 2 cats she had adopted after Benjamin's death, Samson and Delilah. Then she would do some gardening, water her red rose bushes, clean the porch steps, and talk to the squirrels as one would talk to friends. Around noon, she would sit on the veranda, a book on her knees, but her gaze often wandered through the misty windows, staring at an invisible point in the garden. In the afternoon, she would knit, even though no one wore the scarves she made anymore. Sometimes, she would take out her old photo albums and leaf through them silently, her eyes full of mist. His heart was still beating, but without conviction. It was February. Charleston was shivering under an unseasonable cold snap, which had swept in unannounced from the north, gripping the rooftops, freezing the sidewalks, and coating the windows with a thin film of frost. Martha's house, built over a century ago, was not built for these harsh winters. And as if by a twist of fate, her old boiler, faithful for 20 years, gave up the ghost in the early morning, breathing out a last breath of warm heat. Martha, bundled up in a thick dressing gown, tried calling Bill, her regular plumber. Voicemail. She left a polite message, hoping he'd come. But 2 hours later, still no answer. So, on the recommendation of her neighbor, Mr. Franklin, she called a small local service she wasn't familiar with, Morris Heating and Plumbing. They're young, but efficient, he told her. The son is polite. Very hard-working. She left a message with a sigh, unconvinced. An hour later, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she was surprised. Jalen Morris, 23, stood there, tool bag in hand, his breath steaming in the icy air. He was tall, almost 6'3", with an athletic build, but his movements were measured, almost gentle. He had caramel-colored skin, cheeks flushed from the cold, and almond-shaped brown eyes, lively, laughing, but not arrogant. He wore an old work jacket covered in chipped paint, and gloves with holes in them that revealed his reddened fingers. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellis. I've come about the boiler," he said, gently tipping his cap. His voice was calm, deep, with a natural sweetness. No emphasis. No honeyed tone. Just a sincere, almost instinctive respect. Martha studied him for a moment. He looked so young. She almost told him to come back with someone more experienced. But something in his eyes made her change her mind. A mixture of determination and calm that she recognized. He reminded her of some of the young patients she'd met in the emergency room, battered by life, but still with their dignity intact. "Come in," she whispered. He took off his boots in the hallway, put down his tools, and headed downstairs. She watched him surreptitiously from the top of the stairs, her gaze curious. He moved with confidence, like someone who had learned by necessity, not on school benches but in real cold, real escapes, real trouble. After 20 minutes of metallic noises and muffled shocks, he returned, his hands covered in soot. "The pump is dead. But I can replace it. I have the part in my van. It'll take an hour, if that's okay with you." "Of course. Would you like some tea while you wait?" she asked. He smiled, and his face lit up. "I never say no to a nice hot tea." They settled into the kitchen, a small room with antique furniture, where the scent of cinnamon and wax still hung. She poured him a cup, which he held in his hands to warm them. He looked around, and his gaze fell on the living room fireplace, where several frames stood, a smiling man in a Roman collar, Benjamin, 3 children of different ages, and a younger Martha in a white coat. "Do you live here alone?" he asked softly, without prying. "For a while, yes," she replied, blowing on her cup. A simple, but not heavy, silence fell. Then, against all expectations, the conversation began to flow freely. He told her about his mother, who had diabetes and had been helping her since he was 17. About his little sisters, about public school, about the dreams he had put on hold. He loved reading, especially the novels of Baldwin and Toni Morrison. He also wrote a little, sometimes, poems he didn't dare show anyone. Martha spoke of her past as a nurse, of the long nights in the hospital, of the pain of having given everything to a family that barely called him. He listened. Really. Without haste. Without interruption. It was this listening that touched her. It was not a banal exchange. She felt seen, recognized. Not as a fragile old lady, but as a whole person. After repairing the boiler, he put away his tools, put his boots back on, and headed for the door. "Thanks for the tea, and the conversation," he said, smiling. "Come back if you ever need warmth," she replied almost in spite of herself, blushing immediately. He looked at her, surprised, then nodded slowly before leaving. And so it was that, without fanfare or drama, a first crack appeared in Martha Ellis's wall of solitude. He came back. Once. Then another. First to change a faucet. Then to help carry heavy bags. Then, just to chat. And with each visit, the air seemed less cold, even in the depths of winter. As the weeks, then months, passed, Jalen Morris gradually ceased to be simply the young plumber. His presence at Martha's house became almost a ritual. Every Saturday afternoon, he rang the doorbell around 2 p.m., sometimes laden with a bag of homemade donuts, sometimes with a novel or vinyl record under his arm. He said he was coming to check on the boiler, but they both knew it had been working perfectly for a long time. Martha made lemon tea or oatmeal cookies. They sat on the sunroom, the sunlight playing through the windows. Sometimes they did puzzles, slowly, in silence, except for the laughter that erupted when Jalen placed a piece in the wrong place with false confidence. Other times, they cooked together. She taught him recipes from her childhood, sweet potato pie, gumbo, cornbread. He chopped vegetables with diligent concentration, and she took the opportunity to slip in a few anecdotes from her youth. Little by little, the titles and distances fell away. At first, he called her Miss Martha, with that southern politeness, full of respect. Then one day, without realizing it, he simply slipped in. "Thank you, Martha." She remembered it precisely. It was a Saturday in April. She hadn't said anything. But that name spoken informally made her shiver. As if she were becoming a whole woman again, not just a widow or an old lady. She, for her part, called him "my sunshine" the first time, laughing, after he told a comical anecdote about a grumpy customer. But the nickname came up more and more often. And at some point, it wasn't a joke anymore. It was true. Jalen confided in him vast sections of his life. He worked hard to provide for his mother, Veronica, who suffered from severe diabetes. She had also been a nurse once, but had to stop due to her health. Jalen admired her deeply. He had 2 younger sisters, Kayla and Renee, ages 9 and 11. He got them ready for school, helped them with their homework, and made sure they had everything they needed. He had to abandon his literature studies after the sudden death of his father, who died of a heart attack at the age of 46. Since then, he juggled bills, clients, meals, and responsibilities, without ever really taking time for himself. "I don't even know who I am anymore outside of all that," he admitted one day, his voice a little hoarse. Martha listened to her. She wasn't trying to offer solutions. She was just there. Completely. Then, one evening, everything changed. It was a Thursday evening in May. It was still warm. Jalen had arrived unannounced, his eyes red, his gaze lost. He held his phone in one hand, his crumpled jacket in the other. Martha understood immediately. "It's Mom," he whispered. "She had a stroke. She's in the hospital. I found her this morning, lying in the kitchen." He collapsed onto the small kitchen chair, his elbows on the table, tears falling silently. Martha said nothing. She moved gently and took him in her arms. The gesture was neither calculated nor hesitant. It was the pure impulse of a heart acknowledging a pain it had known. His embrace was strong, without judgment, without fear. She felt his body tremble, his breath hitch. And in that simple, human touch, an invisible thread was woven between them, deeper than any words. It was the beginning of something. In the following days, Jalen returned. Less talkative, more tired, but still there. Martha prepared soups, herbal teas, and above all, comforting silence. They spoke little, but everything was said in their looks. Then, one evening in late May, as spring filled the porch with the scent of lilacs, they sat side by side, bare feet on the rug, a Nina Simone record playing softly in the background. It was mild. The light of the setting sun bathed the room in gold and pink. Jalen turned his head toward her. She was reading, peacefully, her glasses on the tip of her nose. He reached out, hesitated, then gently placed his fingers on her cheek. She looked up at him. There were no words. No passionate declaration. Just a charged silence, a hold in her breath. She bowed her head, closed her eyes. And there, in that room filled with old memories, they kissed. There was nothing passionate or rushed about this kiss. It was gentle. Slow. Unexpected but inevitable. A response to months of trust, complicity, and listening. They shared a moment of intimacy that evening. Not out of mere carnal desire, but out of a thirst for tenderness, warmth, and gratitude. Martha, who had loved her husband for 35 years, realized that evening that she had never been viewed in this way, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman. Whole. Desirable. Loved. Jalen, however, found a peace in her arms he'd never known. It wasn't strange or out of place. It was just, natural. The next day, they didn't talk about what had happened. Not right away. But their gestures changed. More tender. More present. They promised each other not to rush into anything. To be cautious. To listen to their hearts. But they already knew. It was no longer just a friendship. It was the beginning of an unlikely, but inevitable love. It was a June morning, one of those mornings when the already mild warmth seeps through the half-open shutters, bringing with it the promise of summer. Martha awoke with a strange unease. A heavy feeling in the pit of her stomach, a bitter taste in her mouth, a persistent nausea creeping in. At first, she thought it was simply a case of fatigue, food poisoning from the old sandwich she'd eaten the day before, or the beginnings of the flu. But as the days passed, the nausea continued unabated. Instead, it became accompanied by dizziness and unusual fatigue. Worried, Martha made an appointment with Dr. Harrison, a trusted physician who had known her for years. In the waiting room, the walls lined with diplomas seemed to weigh on her more than usual. When her turn came, she entered slowly, taking a seat on the worn leather chair. Dr. Harrison examined him carefully, noting his symptoms. He ordered blood tests and a urine test, calmly explaining that he wanted to rule out any infection or other medical problems. In the days that followed, Martha tried to carry on with her life as usual, but anxiety was mounting. Then, finally, the appointment for the results arrived. She walked into the office, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. Dr. Harrison gently closed the medical chart, took a deep breath, then sat down opposite her. His face was serious, almost solemn. "Martha," he said slowly, visibly troubled, "you are pregnant." A suspended silence followed. Martha's eyes widened in disbelief. She laughed nervously, as if the sentence had come from a bad dream or a cruel joke. "Doctor, you're making fun of me, aren't you?" But he shook his head seriously. "No, I'm sorry. Your test is clear. Biologically, it's rare at your age, but not impossible. Your ovaries are still active. We'll have to monitor that closely." Martha remained silent, breathless. Her mind was whirling. She remembered her consistently regular period lately, which she dismissed as simply a sign of stress. And then, Jalen. She left the office in shock. The streets of Charleston seemed blurry, the passers-by unreal silhouettes. She walked slowly, aimlessly, her thoughts jumbled. With every beat of her heart, reality became more tangible and frightening. That evening, sitting in the old armchair in the living room, she picked up her phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number. "Jalen?" she whispered. He answered almost immediately. His voice, soft and warm, brought her some calm. "I have to tell you something," she began hesitantly. She told everything, the symptoms, the visit to the doctor, the verdict. Jalen was silent for a moment, his mouth half open, his eyes wide despite the distance. Then, with a slowness that seemed to weigh each word, he placed his right hand on her belly, as if he could already feel the baby. "If this baby exists," he said finally, his voice filled with gentle conviction, "it's because heaven willed it. We'll get there, Martha. Together." That night, Martha cried. Not from fear. Not from doubt. But from a profound mixture of hope and gratitude. She knew that life was about to change, that nothing would ever be the same again. But, for the first time in a long time, she felt a promise deep inside her, that of a new beginning. When the news broke, it hit the small community of Charleston like a hurricane. Rumors traveled faster than the warm summer wind, and soon everyone seemed to be talking about them, about Martha Ellis, the 61-year-old pregnant by her 23-year-old plumber, Jalen Morris. Clara, the eldest child, soon arrived at her mother's house, her features drawn and her eyes blazing with anger. She entered without knocking, slamming her bag down on the kitchen table. "Mom, do you realize what you're doing?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. "You're going to be a laughingstock all over Charleston, all over the family. He could be your grandson, for heaven's sake." Martha remained calm, despite the pain burning in her heart. She looked at her daughter, the woman she had raised, then looked down at her still rounded belly. "Clara, what you don't understand is that this baby is a miracle. And Jalen, he's anything but what you think." Meanwhile, Michael, his youngest son, was far away. On a mission, at a military base overseas. They spoke via video, the connection unstable, his face tired but stern. "This is unhealthy, Mom," he breathed, his voice betraying shame mixed with fear. "Jalen is manipulating you. You're not yourself. You're going to ruin everything." Martha felt her heart clench. But she refused to give in. Michael, she replied softly but firmly, what I have with Jalen, I never had with Benjamin, your father. He made me come alive. And this baby is proof that love doesn't end with age. The days that followed were a struggle. Neighbors, who until then had greeted her courteously, turned away. There were whispers, heavy looks. Then, one evening, a video of them at the market, smiling, their hands accidentally brushing against each other, leaked onto social media. The comments were cruel, degenerate, sick, abusive, madness. Insults rained down, some even threatening Martha on her personal social media. But in this storm, there were also voices in their defense. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, once slipped an envelope under her door. Martha opened it, trembling. Inside, a handwritten letter in blue ink. Martha, I wish I had your courage. True love is rare. It doesn't look at the calendar. Never give up. These words were a balm. A breath of fresh air. The day of delivery arrived, fraught with emotion. Martha was admitted to the Charleston hospital, surrounded by a nervous but deeply moved medical team, who were deeply moved by this unique case. The staff monitored every heartbeat, every movement, aware of the importance of this moment. After several hours of effort, under a warm white light, Martha gave birth by cesarean section to a strong little boy, weighing 2.8 kilograms. The baby opened his eyes to this world, and everyone immediately noticed the mix of features that made him unique, Jalen's sparkling brown eyes, and Martha's familiar little dimples. They named him Elias Hope Morricellis, Elias, symbol of salvation, hope, hope. Outside, the world still screamed, refusing to understand. But in the bedroom, Jalen, dressed in a sterile blue scrubs, trembled as he held his son for the first time. Silent tears streamed down his cheeks. Mom performed a miracle, he whispered to his son, his voice breaking with emotion. You are my light. Martha, exhausted but radiant, placed her hand on Jalen's. This is just the beginning, she said softly. 2 years had passed since Elias's birth. Martha and Jalen's lives had changed profoundly, but more importantly, they had settled into a fragile and precious balance. They had left the large Victorian house with white shutters, too cumbersome to maintain and too full of memories of a past they had chosen to leave behind. Martha had sold the house with a mixture of emotion and relief, preferring to settle with Jalen and their son in a more modest house, nestled in a quiet neighborhood of Charleston, away from prying eyes and incessant whispers. With the money from the sale, Martha had financed Jalen's training. He was now taking advanced courses in plumbing and business management, determined to start his own company. She had embraced this dream with him, proud to see the young man rise step by step, despite the difficulties. Their daily lives were punctuated by the small joys and challenges of parenthood. Diaper changes, nighttime awakenings, and hearty laughter that filled the house with new, sweet music. Martha, though marked by time, her wrinkles were deeper, her hands more veiny, smiled wider and brighter than ever. She radiated a strength many would envy. Elias grew up surrounded by immense love, a love without conditions or explanation. He didn't know that his mother was 61 when he was born, nor that their story had caused a scandal. To him, she was simply his mother, the one who sang him lullabies softly at night, the one who held him tight when he cried, the one who told him stories of courage and hope. And that was all that mattered. Their story had divided. She had shocked some, hurt others, and inspired a handful of brave souls. The criticisms had fallen, the judgments rained down, but they sought neither approval nor excuses. They knew the truth of their bond, the depth of their love. Because at the end of the day, love has no age. It doesn't need to be explained or justified. He just has a name. Elias.